There's an island in Michigan where the most advanced technology you'll encounter is a bicycle built sometime during the Coolidge administration. No cars, no Ubers, no DoorDash drivers idling outside your Airbnb. Just horses, carriages, and the weird sensation that you've accidentally wandered onto a movie set, except everyone here actually lives like this, and they're not particularly interested in your Instagram story about it. That island is real. It's not a theme park, and it's one of 8 places in America where time didn't stop so much as politely declined to participate in whatever the hell the rest of us have been doing for the last 50 years. We're told constantly that the America we remember, or think we remember, or wish we remembered, is gone. Stripped for parts, paved over, replaced by a Target next to an Applebee's, next to a storage facility shaped like a bunker. But that's not entirely true. There are still towns where Main Street means something, where people know their neighbors' names without checking Ring camera footage, where a Friday night doesn't involve scrolling past 15 streaming options before giving up and re-watching The Office again. These aren't living history museums. They're not Williamsburg with better Wi-Fi. They're actual communities that either refuse to abandon what worked or got so lucky or so unlucky, depending on your perspective, that progress forgot about them entirely. And now, while the rest of America argues about whether we can ever go back, these towns are quietly proving we never had to leave in the first place. So we're counting down 8 small towns that feel like America used to. Not the sanitized nostalgic version, the real version. Front porches and corner diners. And the understanding that you can't just order your entire life from an app and expect to feel human. Some kept their main streets. Some kept their manners. One banned cars entirely and dared the 20th century to do something about it. If you've ever felt like the country lost something essential in the race to get faster, cheaper, and more convenient, hit subscribe. And drop a comment with the oldest town you've ever visited. The kind of place that made you wonder if maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere. Let's find out where the old America's been hiding. We start in the northwest corner of Illinois, 3 hours from Chicago, but approximately 70 years away in every other measurable sense. Galena sits in the hills overlooking the Galena River like it's been posed there since 1850, which is roughly accurate. Population 3,200. 85% of the buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places, which is a polite way of saying this town looks exactly like your great-grandparents' wedding photos, assuming your great-grandparents got married somewhere with functioning taste. Here's what Galena has that your town probably doesn't anymore. A main street where things happen, not a historic downtown with 3 open storefronts and a Spirit Halloween pop-up. An actual commercial district with bakeries, bookstores, antique shops run by people who can tell you the provenance of every piece of furniture without Googling it. You can walk 6 blocks and encounter 0 national chains, which in 2025 feels like a minor miracle or a complete accident of geography. The median home price here sits around $285,000. According to Zillow data from the last quarter. That's what a parking space costs in Boston, and here it comes with an actual 3-bedroom Victorian that was already architecturally significant when your great-grandparents were figuring out indoor plumbing. You're buying a home in a town that hasn't been turned into a generic node on the interstate highway system, and people will pay extra for that, because the alternative is a subdivision in Des Moines where every house looks like it was designed by the same AI with depression. Galena survived because it failed. It was a lead mining boomtown in the 1800s, peaked around the Civil War when Ulysses S. Grant lived here. Then the lead ran out and the town went to sleep for about 100 years. No money for urban renewal, no reason to tear down the old buildings and replace them with concrete parking structures. By the time anyone remembered Galena existed, it was too perfectly preserved to screw up, and tourism became the new industry. 17,000 people visit on an average weekend, which should ruin everything, but somehow doesn't. The trade-off is that you're living in a place where the economy runs on antique stores and bed and breakfasts. If you need a job that isn't hospitality adjacent, you're driving to Dubuque. The nearest major airport is an hour away. Your dinner options are charming bistros and historic taverns, which sounds great until you realize there's nowhere to get decent Thai food, and the one pizza place closes at 9 because the owner has to be up early for the farmer's market. But here's what you get. You can walk to everything. Your kid's school is 4 blocks away in a building from 1857 that still has the original bell tower. The 4th of July parade goes right down Main Street, and people actually line up to watch it instead of staying home to avoid traffic. On Saturday mornings, the farmer's market sets up in the park, and you'll run into the same neighbors every week because there aren't enough people here to avoid anyone. Picture this: October in Galena, leaves turning on the hillsides, brick buildings glowing in that late afternoon light. You're walking home from the coffee shop with a book you just bought from an actual bookstore with a human who recommended it. No Amazon confirmation email, no algorithm suggesting you might also like 7 other books based on your browsing history. Just a book from a person in a town that still operates like books and people and face-to-face transactions matter. Does it fix everything wrong with modern America? No, but it suggests that maybe the problem wasn't inevitable. Maybe we just stopped trying. Galena kept Main Street alive through lucky failure. Too broke to tear things down, too preserved to screw up once money returned. But what happens when a town doesn't just preserve buildings by accident? What happens when an entire community decides to preserve language, culture, and social traditions that the rest of America abandoned 5 generations ago, and does it so thoroughly that tourists show up expecting a museum and find an actual functioning ethnic enclave instead? From Illinois, we drive south into Missouri wine country, which is a sentence that surprises people who think all American wine comes from Napa Valley and all Midwest culture comes from a gas station attached to a subway. Herman sits on the Missouri River about 90 miles west of St. Louis, and it has been aggressively, defiantly German since 1837, when a group of immigrants from Philadelphia decided they needed to preserve their language and culture before America's melting pot dissolved it entirely. They succeeded. Walk through Herman today and you'll see German street names, German architecture, German-style wineries still operating in stone cellars built in the 1840s. The town looks like someone airlifted a Bavarian village into the Missouri hills and just left it there to ferment. Population 2,100. Median home price around $195,000 per Redfin's latest data. Less than a down payment in St. Louis gets you the entire house here, with original woodwork and the kind of craftsmanship that makes modern construction look like it was assembled by a team of reasonably intelligent raccoons. This isn't heritage tourism where everyone dresses up once a year for Oktoberfest and then goes back to their lives. Herman's German identity is structural. The town was designed as a German colony, laid out in a grid with a central market square, built with the assumption that beer and wine and sausage and communal festivals weren't optional lifestyle accessories, but essential components of civilization. That philosophy has outlasted most of the original families, but the infrastructure remains, and the infrastructure shapes behavior. There are no chain restaurants in the historic district, not because of some city ordinance, though that probably helps, but because there's no room. The buildings are too old, the streets too narrow, the parking too limited. If Applebee's wanted to open here, they'd have to renovate a 180-year-old brewery, and at that point, why bother? The entire town is grandfathered into a previous century's building codes, which makes development nearly impossible and preservation nearly automatic. The wine industry keeps Herman alive. According to the Missouri Wine and Grape Board, the region produces more than 1 million gallons annually, and most of it gets sold to tourists who drive in from St. Louis or Kansas City for the weekend. That's the economic engine. People paying to experience a version of small-town America that doesn't exist anymore in most places. You're buying wine, but you're also buying the fantasy that community cohesion is still possible, that towns can have identities more specific than Exit 47 off the highway. The cost of that fantasy is isolation. You're an hour and a half from St. Louis, 45 minutes from Columbia. If you need specialized medical care or a job that isn't tourism or agriculture, you're commuting or you're out of luck. The school district is small, well-rated, but small. Your kid's graduating class will have 60 people in it, which is either intimate or suffocating depending on your tolerance for everyone knowing everyone's business. But here's the thing about Herman that sets it apart from Galena. This town didn't just preserve buildings, it preserved a social model. The Mayfest, the Oktoberfest, the Wurstfest. These aren't Chamber of Commerce inventions. They're continuation of actual traditions, communal events where the whole town shows up, because that's what you do in a place where social cohesion isn't an abstract concept but a survival strategy. When your economy depends on convincing outsiders that authentic community still exists, you have to actually maintain authentic community, and that creates a feedback loop that most American towns abandoned 3 strip malls ago. One local vintner put it this way off the record: "We're not trying to be Napa. Napa's trying to be what we've always been, a place where wine is an excuse to gather, not a luxury product." Picture this: late September in Herman, Oktoberfest weekend. The town square packed with people, accordion music drifting from the bandstand, the smell of bratwurst and sauerkraut cutting through the autumn air. You're sitting at a communal table with strangers who stopped being strangers 2 beers ago, and someone's grandmother is teaching your kid a German folk dance that her grandmother taught her. This isn't heritage tourism. This is what happens when a town refuses to let its culture become a museum exhibit. It stays alive, functional, and genuinely hospitable in ways that can't be manufactured by a Chamber of Commerce branding committee. Herman proved you can preserve ethnicity and tradition if you're stubborn enough and isolated enough, but can you preserve social fabric? Can you maintain the manners, the pace, the understanding that efficiency isn't the highest virtue? And can you do it in a place beautiful enough and accessible enough that thousands of outsiders show up every year trying to buy into that exact lifestyle? We leave the Midwest and head to the Lowcountry, where the air smells like salt marsh and pluff mud and the kind of old money that doesn't need to announce itself. Beaufort sits on Port Royal Island between Charleston and Savannah. Pronounced BW Fort if you're local and BOE Fort if you're about to get corrected. Population 13,600, median home price $485,000 according to Zillow, which is high for South Carolina but low for what you're actually getting. Antebellum architecture, moss-draped oaks, and a town where people still sit on front porches and talk to neighbors instead of retreating into climate-controlled isolation. Beaufort survived the Civil War mostly intact because Union forces occupied it early and used it as a headquarters. That accident of military strategy means the historic district still has homes from the 1700s, columned mansions that look like they're waiting for someone to ride up on horseback and deliver a telegram. But the architecture isn't what makes Beaufort feel like old America. It's the pace. It's the social contract that says you don't walk past someone without acknowledging them. It's the understanding that efficiency isn't the highest virtue, that sometimes the point of going to the hardware store is the conversation with the guy who's worked there for 30 years and knows exactly which hinge you need and also how your daughter's doing at college. This is the South that people who've never been to the South think exists everywhere below the Mason-Dixon line. Genteel, unhurried, obsessed with propriety and lineage and whether your grandmother went to the same church as their grandmother. In most places, that version of the South is extinct, replaced by suburban sprawl and Chick-fil-A drive-thrus. In Beaufort, it's still operational, though increasingly complicated by retirees from the Northeast and military families from the nearby Marine Corps Air Station, who bring their own cultural assumptions and occasionally clash with the locals over the correct speed for conducting business, which in Beaufort is slow enough to maintain civility. The Beaufort Regional Chamber of Commerce reports that tourism contributes $250 million annually to the local economy, which means this town is also selling nostalgia, not Civil War nostalgia. Thankfully, Beaufort's done a better job than most southern towns at reckoning with that particular past, but nostalgia for a version of American life where you could walk downtown, run into people you knew, conduct your errands without feeling like you were being optimized for corporate efficiency. The trade-offs here are substantial. You're buying into a place with deep social hierarchies, where your last name and your family's history matter in ways that feel either charming or claustrophobic depending on whether you're inside or outside those networks. The cost of living is higher than the surrounding rural areas because you're paying for access to a preserved downtown and a waterfront that hasn't been ruined by high-rise condos. Job opportunities are limited unless you're in healthcare, education, or tourism. The nearest major city is Charleston, an hour away, which is doable but not convenient. But here's what you get that you can't get in most of America anymore: walkability that isn't an urban planning buzzword but an actual feature of daily life. The historic district is 12 blocks by 8 blocks, and you can cover most of your needs on foot. The schools are good, the crime rate is low, and people still dress up for church on Sunday, not because anyone's making them, but because that's the culture, and culture turns out to be surprisingly durable when it's reinforced by architecture and geography and the kind of social pressure that comes from living in a place where everyone knows if you didn't show up. A local realtor told us off the record, People move here thinking they want the slower pace, then complain that the bank closes at 4 and nobody's in a hurry at the post office. You can't have it both ways. The slowness is the point. Picture this. Evening in Beaufort, late spring. You're walking through the historic district as the sun sets over the marsh. Front porches full of people in rocking chairs. Kids riding bikes in the street because traffic's light enough that it's safe. Someone you barely know waves from their porch and asks how you're doing, and they actually wait for an answer. It's the America of Hallmark movies, except real and therefore complicated by the fact that all these social graces come with expectations about who you are and how you'll behave. Is it accessible to everyone? No. The cost of entry is high, both financially and socially, but it demonstrates that the fabric of small-town community life doesn't have to disintegrate just because the country got wired for high-speed internet. Beaufort kept its manners through cultural inertia and social pressure, the kind of thing that works when you're dealing with southern gentility and inherited expectations about behavior. But what about the West, where the culture is supposed to be individualistic, anti-establishment, and deeply suspicious of anyone telling you how to live? Can authenticity survive there when the art world shows up with money and taste and a determination to make your town cool whether you want it or not? We head west to the high desert of far west Texas, where the nearest city of any size is El Paso, 3 hours away, and the landscape looks like God got bored halfway through creating it and wandered off to work on something more interesting. Marfa sits at 4,700 feet elevation in the Chihuahuan Desert, population 1,700, and it has somehow managed to be simultaneously an international art destination and an actual ranching town where people still wear working cowboy boots, not the $800 fashion kind you buy in Soho. And if you thought Herman felt remote at 90 miles from St. Louis, Marfa redefines the concept entirely. We're talking 3 hours from El Paso, which itself is 3 hours from anywhere else that matters. The nearest Costco is 200 miles away. The nearest population center that understands why you'd voluntarily live here is approximately 2,000 miles away, probably in Brooklyn. This should be impossible. When the art world discovers a remote town and decides to make it cool, the original town usually dies. Locals get priced out, galleries replace hardware stores, the whole place becomes a simulation of itself for wealthy weekenders. Marfa avoided that fate partially through luck and partially through the sheer hostility of its location. You can't casually visit Marfa. You have to commit to the drive, the isolation, the fact that the nearest Costco is 200 miles away in El Paso. That filters out the kind of transplants who want authenticity but also want DoorDash and same-day Amazon delivery. The median home price is around $310,000 per Radfin data, which is high for rural Texas but low for an internationally known art destination. You're getting that price because Marfa is genuinely in the middle of nowhere, and middle of nowhere turns out to be an effective moat against runaway development. There's no tech industry, no remote workers flooding in from California, just ranchers, artists, service workers for the tourism industry, and a handful of eccentrics who moved here because they wanted to disappear without actually leaving civilization entirely. The town's art credentials are real. Donald Judd moved here in the 1970s, bought up buildings, installed massive minimalist sculptures in the desert. The Chainati Foundation now manages his work, and people fly in from New York and Los Angeles to see art in a landscape that makes the art feel inevitable instead of precious. But Marfa never stopped being a ranching community. The Presidio County Courthouse still dominates the town square. The local weekly paper, the Big Bend Sentinel, still covers livestock prices and school board meetings alongside gallery openings. What makes Marfa feel like old America isn't the art, it's the isolation. No stoplights, no chain restaurants except a Dairy Queen that the town treats like a cultural landmark, because even Dairy Queen seems like cosmopolitan luxury when you're this far from everywhere else. People wave when they drive past, not because they're performing small town friendliness for tourists, but because there are so few people here that not waving would be actively rude. The trade-offs are severe. You're 5 hours from a major airport. Medical care beyond basics requires a drive to Alpine or El Paso. The school district is tiny, adequately funded, but tiny. If your career requires face-to-face meetings or cultural infrastructure beyond what a town of 1,700 can support, you're out of luck. The summers are brutal, the winters surprisingly cold, and the wind is relentless in a way that makes you understand why pioneers went insane on the plains. But here's the paradox. Marfa's artistic reputation exists because the town stayed authentically itself. The art world fetishizes authenticity, and Marfa had it in abundance. Wide open space spaces, clear light, a population that didn't care what New York thought about anything. That authenticity attracted artists, but the isolation prevented the artists from completely transforming the place. You can't gentrify a town that's 6 hours from the nearest Whole Foods. The logistics defeat you. A rancher who's lived here his whole life put it this way: the art people come and go, the land stays, the cattle stay. We were here before minimalism, we'll be here after. Picture this: midnight in Marfa, winter. The sky so clear you can see the Milky Way in detail most Americans have only seen in photographs. You're standing in the empty town square, and the silence is so complete you can hear the railroad crossing bells from 2 miles away. No traffic, no sirens, no ambient hum of a city that never sleeps. Just stars and wind and the understanding that you're exactly where the Old West still exists. Not as a tourist attraction, but as an ongoing condition of life. Is it practical for most people? Absolutely not. But it proves that remoteness can be a preservation strategy. That some version of small-town American life survives best when it's too far away for the forces of homogenization to bother with. Marfa used distance as a moat. But distance isn't the only natural defense against modern development. What happens when a town sits in a landscape so beautiful it attracts thousands of visitors, but the geography itself limits how much you can build, how much you can expand, how much you can screw it up before you destroy the very thing people came to see. We return to the upper Midwest, to the south shore of Lake Superior, where Bayfield sits on a hillside overlooking the Apostle Islands like a postcard that somehow achieved sentience and decided to incorporate as a municipality. Population 450. You read that right, 450 people. This is the smallest town on our list, and possibly the most determined to remain exactly what it's always been. A fishing village, an orchard town, a jumping off point for sailors and kayakers, and people who think civilization peaked somewhere around 1955 and has been negotiating its decline ever since. Median home price runs around $380,000, according to Zillow, which seems insane for a town of 450 until you see what you're buying. Victorian homes with views of the largest freshwater lake on the planet, walking distance to a functional downtown, access to a landscape so pristine it looks like a Great Lakes propaganda poster. You're paying for beauty and isolation in equal measure, and for the privilege of living in a place where the rhythms of life are still dictated by natural cycles instead of quarterly earnings reports. Bayfield survives on tourism, fishing, and orchards, primarily apples, cherries, and berries that grow well in the microclimate created by the lake. The growing season is short, the winters are punishing, and the entire economy shifts between summer boom and winter hibernation with the kind of regularity that used to define most of American agricultural life and now defines almost none of it. The tourists show up Memorial Day through October, sail the Apostle Islands, buy fruit from roadside stands, eat whitefish at the local restaurants, then vanish. Winter population drops to year-round residents who've made peace with snow, cold, and the fact that half the businesses close until spring. This seasonal rhythm forces a kind of community cohesion you don't get in places with year-round economic activity. When winter hits and the tourists leave, the people who remain are the ones committed to staying, and that creates social bonds based on shared endurance. You're not networking, you're surviving together. The high school has maybe 50 kids total. Everyone knows everyone, which is either comforting or suffocating depending on whether you're trying to build a life or escape one. The Bayfield Chamber of Commerce reports that tourism generates roughly $60 million annually for the county, which for a town of 450 is a staggering ratio. But somehow Bayfield hasn't been ruined by its own success. No high-rise hotels, no national chains. The downtown is 6 blocks of locally owned shops, restaurants, galleries, and the kind of maritime supply stores that serve actual commercial fishermen, not just yachters with disposable income. Why didn't tourism kill Bayfield the way it killed so many other beautiful small towns? Geography mostly. There's only one road in, and Lake Superior to the north creates a natural boundary that prevents sprawl. You can't build much more than what's already here without destroying the landscape people came to see in the first place, and destroying the landscape would eliminate the economic base. So development stays constrained by its own logic. The trade-offs are obvious. You're 3 hours from Duluth, 4 from Minneapolis. Medical care is limited. Job opportunities are almost entirely seasonal or service-based. If you need a career that isn't tourism, fishing, or agriculture adjacent, you're commuting or working remotely, or you're not living here. The winters are genuinely harsh. Lake Superior moderates temperatures, but that means lake effect snow measured in feet, not inches. The growing season is 90 days if you're lucky, but here's what you get. You can walk to the marina in the morning, buy fresh whitefish off the boat, then walk home past orchards that have been family-owned for 4 generations. Your neighbors aren't strangers you avoid in the elevator. They're people you see at the same coffee shop every morning, at the same grocery store, at the town meetings where local politics still matter because the town is small enough that your vote actually affects outcomes. Picture this: September in Bayfield, apple harvest in full swing, fall colors starting on the hillsides. You're walking through town at dusk, sailboats rocking gently in the marina, and you run into the same 6 people you see every day. Not because the town is boring, but because the town is small enough that human connection isn't optional. You can't be anonymous here. You have to be a person, known to other people, embedded in a community whether you planned on it or not. Is it isolated? Yes. Is it economically precarious? Absolutely. But it demonstrates that natural beauty can sustain a community if the community is willing to accept the constraints that come with protecting that beauty. And if Bayfield preserved itself through geography, our next town shows what happens when locals decide to preserve their town through sheer stubborn refusal to modernize. We head to the northern Idaho Panhandle, to a town nestled between Lake Pend Oreille and the Selkirk Mountains, where Sandpoint sits like the platonic ideal of a western mountain town that hasn't been completely colonized by tech money. Yet. Population 9,200, median home price around $565,000 per Redfin, which is high for Idaho, but still achievable compared to what you'd pay in Bozeman or Bend or any other mountain town that got discovered by remote workers with Silicon Valley salaries. That's roughly what a 1-bedroom condo costs in Seattle, except here you get a house with a view of the largest lake in Idaho and a ski resort you can actually afford to use. Sandpoint still feels like a working town. There's a railroad, an actual working railroad with freight trains that rumble through downtown multiple times a day, which should be annoying but somehow isn't because it signals that this place has economic functions beyond serving as a scenic backdrop for vacation homes. The railroad employed generations of families here, still does, along with timber, tourism, and most resort communities lost decades ago. The downtown is intact. Local shops, local restaurants, a historic theater, and a ski resort, Schweitzer Mountain, that's big enough to be legitimate, but small enough that you can still get lift tickets without selling a kidney. The lake is pristine, the hiking is world class, and the whole town looks like it was designed by someone who actually understood how mountain communities are supposed to function before private equity discovered them. But here's the tension. Sandpoint is being discovered. Remote workers are arriving, Californians fleeing high costs and politics, retirees cashing out of expensive markets and buying homes with cash, driving up prices for locals who've been here their whole lives. According to US Census data, Bonner County grew 18% between 2010 and 2020, and that growth is accelerating. The median home price has increased 47% in the last 5 years. That's not catastrophic yet, but it's heading in a direction every other beautiful mountain town has gone, and the locals know it. What makes Sandpoint different, for now, is that locals still run things. The city council isn't dominated by transplants. The school board still prioritizes local needs over newcomer demands. The businesses downtown are still mostly owned by people who've been here for decades, not venture-backed startups testing out a mountain town lifestyle brand. Beaufort figured out how to absorb outsiders without completely losing its character. Marfa's isolation made absorption nearly impossible. Sandpoint's caught right at the inflection point. Enough newcomers to threaten the culture, not enough distance to protect it. The question isn't whether Sandpoint will change, it's whether locals can control how it changes before the decision gets made for them by people with California equity and Zoom careers. There's a culture of resistance to the kind of development that would turn Sandpoint into another Aspen, and that culture is holding, barely. The trade-offs are getting worse. If you're a young person who grew up here, you're probably leaving because you can't afford to buy a home. If you're working class, you're being slowly priced out by people who can pay above asking in cash. The jobs that sustained this town, timber, railroad, manufacturing, are shrinking, and the jobs replacing them, tourism, service work, remote employment, pay less or require skills that aren't evenly distributed. But here's what Sandpoint still has that most mountain towns have lost: economic authenticity. This isn't a town where the only jobs are serving rich people. There's still industry, still infrastructure, still a working class base that keeps the place grounded. You can get your truck fixed at a shop that's been family owned since 1967. You can buy lumber from a mill that still processes local timber. The guy who runs the coffee shop also works seasonal construction because that's what you do in a mountain town where economic diversity is the difference between survival and collapse. One longtime resident put it this way: we're at the point where we either fight to stay who we are, or we give up and become the next Jackson Hole. And once that happens, it's over. The locals leave, the character dies, and you're left with a beautiful museum where rich people come to pretend they're outdoorsy. Picture this: winter evening in Sandpoint, snow falling, mountains invisible in the dark. You're walking through downtown, past the old theater showing a second-run movie, past the brewery where locals gather because the tourists stay at the resort. You know half the people here, not because you're trying to network, but because in a town of 9,200, community isn't optional. You run into your kid's teacher, the guy who fixed your furnace last month, the woman who sold you your house. This is what small town life was supposed to be before it became a luxury product. Is it sustainable? Probably not at this trajectory, but it proves that mountain towns can retain their character if locals organize, resist, and prioritize community over profit. For now, and if Sandpoint is fighting to stay authentic, our next town legally mandated the right to never change. We descend into the Ozark Mountains of northwest Arkansas, where Eureka Springs clings to steep hillsides like a Victorian fever dream that achieves municipal incorporation. Population 2,200, no straight streets. Literally, the city has an ordinance against them. No chain stores allowed in the historic district, no traffic lights, and a commitment to historical preservation so extreme it borders on defiance, as if the entire town looked at 20th century America and said, no thanks, we're good here. This isn't accidental preservation. Eureka Springs made a deliberate choice in the 1970s to protect its character through city ordinances that regulate everything from building heights to architectural styles to what kinds of businesses can operate downtown. The result is a town that looks nearly identical to how it looked in 1890, when it was a booming resort destination built around natural springs that people believed had healing properties. The springs didn't heal anyone, the boom ended, and Eureka Springs spent most of the 20th century in quiet decline before reinventing itself as an artist colony and LGBTQ-friendly haven in the middle of deeply conservative Arkansas. The median home price is around $320,000, according to Zillow, which gets you a Victorian cottage built into a hillside at an angle that makes you question whether the house is charming or structurally unsound. Everything here is stairs. You park your car at the bottom of the hill and climb to your front door. You walk to the grocery store and climb back. The entire town is a cardiovascular workout disguised as a quaint tourist destination. And if you can't handle stairs, you can't handle Eureka Springs, the downtown, if you can call it that, since the whole town is essentially one continuous historic district, is full of galleries, antique shops, bed and breakfasts, and restaurants that range from genuinely good to clearly catering to tourists who won't be back. The tourism economy generates roughly $300 million annually for the region, according to the Eureka Springs Chamber of Commerce, which for a town of 2,200 is a dependency ratio that should terrify anyone thinking about long-term sustainability. But here's the paradox: Eureka Springs is sustainable precisely because it's unsustainable for most modern businesses. You can't build a Walmart here. The terrain won't allow it. You can't run a national chain restaurant efficiently when delivery trucks have to navigate hairpin turns on streets barely wide enough for one vehicle. Mackinac Island banned cars in 1898 and became famous for it. Eureka Springs didn't need to ban them. The mountains did it naturally. Try running a delivery route when every address requires switchbacks and a prayer. The physical constraints that make life difficult also make corporate homogenization impossible, and that's been the town's salvation. The trade-offs are substantial. You're an hour from Bentonville, where Walmart's headquarters sits, and where the Northwest Arkansas economy is booming. You're 2 hours from Springfield, Missouri. Medical care is limited. Jobs are almost entirely tourism or arts-based. If you're not running a business that caters to visitors, your employment options are slim. The school district is small, underfunded, and serves a population that skews heavily toward retirees and artists, not young families. But here's what Eureka Springs has that almost nowhere else does: legally protected character. The city didn't just hope development would be sensitive to local aesthetics. It mandated preservation through law, then enforced those laws even when it meant turning away economic opportunities. That's rare. Most towns will compromise their character for a big box store or a hotel chain that promises jobs and tax revenue. Eureka Springs said no repeatedly and built an entire economy around the fact that people will pay to visit a place that refuses to look like everywhere else. A local artist told us, yeah, we're not trying to be Gatlinburg. Gatlinburg sold out, and now it's a tourist trap with a Ripley's Believe It or Not. We decided we'd rather be poor and weird than rich and generic. So far, we're succeeding at both. Picture this: evening in Eureka Springs, midsummer. You're sitting on a porch, because every house has a porch, it's legally required, watching the sun set over the mountains. The streets below are full of pedestrians because driving here is absurd and everyone knows it. You hear live music from 3 different venues, smell dinner cooking from the restaurant down the hill, and wave to neighbors passing by. Not because you're performing small town friendliness, but because the town is small enough and walkable enough that avoiding people would require active effort. Is it practical? Not really. Is it replicable? Probably not. But it demonstrates that American towns can preserve their identities if they're willing to accept economic constraints and aesthetic limitations in exchange for remaining themselves. And if Eureka Springs proved that legal protection could save a town's character, our final destination took it one step further and banned modernity entirely. We end where we began, on an island in northern Michigan where the most transformative invention of the 20th century never arrived, or rather, arrived briefly in the 1890s and got itself permanently banned in 1898. No cars, no motorcycles, no motorized vehicles of any kind except emergency vehicles and snowmobiles in winter when the island is accessible only by plane. Just horses, bicycles, and the deeply weird experience of stepping off a ferry into a place that looks, sounds, and smells like America did in 1920. Mackinac Island sits in the straits between Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Population 500 year-round, swelling to thousands in summer when tourists arrive to gawk at the Grand Hotel, buy fudge from shops that have been selling fudge since before their great-grandparents were born, and pretend they've time-traveled to an era when transportation was slow, inefficient, and powered by animals. This isn't a gimmick. The car ban is genuine, enforced, and the result of an early 20th century decision by residents who looked at automobiles and decided they were loud, dangerous, and incompatible with the island's primary industry, which was and remains tourism based on preserving historical character. They were right. If Mackinac Island had allowed cars, it would look like every other resort town in Michigan: strip malls, traffic, and a waterfront ruined by parking lots. Instead, it looks like a Victorian postcard, and people pay substantial money to experience that. The median home price is difficult to pin down because real estate transactions here are rare and weird, but what's available runs well over $500,000 for anything habitable, and most properties are summer homes or commercial buildings. Year-round residency is a commitment. You're living on an island with no cars, limited ferry service in winter, and an economy that hibernates for 6 months. The schools are small, medical care is basic, serious emergencies get airlifted to the mainland. Your grocery options are one store that charges island prices, meaning you'll pay $8 for a gallon of milk because everything has to be ferried over and hauled by horse-drawn cart. But here's what Mackinac Island preserved by banning cars: walkability, quiet, and a pace of life that forces you to slow down because you physically cannot go fast. You can't rush anywhere. The fastest you're moving is on a bicycle, and even that feels leisurely compared to the relentless speed of mainland life. People sit on porches, they talk to neighbors, they walk to work, to the store, to church because there's no other option, and that constraint creates community in ways that car-dependent America abandoned decades ago. The Grand Hotel still operates like it did in 1887, jacket and tie required for dinner, rocking chairs on the world's longest porch, afternoon tea service that people actually attend without irony. This should feel like a theme park, but it doesn't, because the island's commitment is total. Everyone's playing the same game. The garbage collectors use horses, the UPS driver uses a horse. The ambulance is horse-drawn unless someone's dying, in which case they call the helicopter. There's no breaking character because there's no character to break. This is just how the island works. The trade-offs are extreme. You cannot own a car here. You cannot drive to the hospital, the airport, or the grocery store. Winter is isolating to a degree most Americans can't imagine. The job market is almost entirely seasonal tourism. If you're not independently wealthy or willing to work in hospitality, you're not living here year-round. The island's population skews heavily toward retirees and people running family businesses that have been on the island for generations. But here's the circular callback to our hook. Mackinac Island is the ultimate proof that the America we think we lost never had to disappear. We didn't lose walkable towns because walkability became impossible. We lost them because we chose cars over community, speed over cohesion, and convenience over the kind of forced social interaction that builds relationships. Mackinac Island made the opposite choice in 1898 and never looked back. A local who's lived here year-round for 30 years told us, "People come here and say it's like going back in time. It's not. It's just a different set of trade-offs. We traded speed for sanity, convenience for community, and the freedom to go anywhere for the freedom to actually know our neighbors." Picture this: dawn on Mackinac Island, mid-October. The tourists are gone. The ferries run twice a day. You're riding a bicycle down an empty street past Victorian homes that have looked the same for 100 years, and the only sound is the wind off the lake and the clip-clop of a horse pulling a delivery cart. No engine noise, no traffic. No ambient hum of a world optimized for efficiency at the expense of everything else. Just you, the island, and the understanding that you're living in the last place in America where modernity agreed to stay on the mainland. Is it practical for most people? Absolutely not. Is it sustainable long term? Probably only because tourism keeps funding it, but it proves the central point we've been building toward. The America we think we lost, the walkable towns, the neighborly interactions, the slower pace, didn't vanish because it was impossible. It vanished because we stopped prioritizing it. Mackinac Island prioritized it, banned the thing that would destroy it, and 126 years later, it's still here. So here's what we found. 8 towns, 8 different preservation strategies, one common thread. None of them got here by accident. Galena survived because it failed economically and couldn't afford to tear itself down. Hermann stayed German because immigrants built it that way and descendants refused to let it become generic. Beaufort kept its manners because the culture was strong enough to survive tourism. Marfa stayed authentic because it's too far from anywhere for gentrification to fully take hold. Bayfield's geography protected it. Sandpoint's locals are fighting for it. Eureka Springs legislated it, and Mackinac Island banned the one invention that would have killed it. The pattern is clear. The America we miss didn't disappear inevitably. It disappeared because we chose convenience over community, speed over stability, and the freedom to go anywhere over the commitment to be somewhere. These 8 towns made different choices, and they're still here, still functioning, still proving that small town life doesn't have to be a nostalgic fantasy or a museum exhibit. Are they perfect? No. Are they accessible to everyone? Absolutely not. But they demonstrate that preservation is possible if you're willing to accept constraints, and that community requires commitment, not just sentiment. If this resonated, hit subscribe, drop a comment with the oldest town you've ever visited, share this with someone who's tired of every place looking like every other place, and maybe next time someone tells you we can't go back, ask them if they've ever tried.